The sound of Karen Pemberton's heels clicking on my cabin's wooden deck was drowned out only by the buzz of 3 legal summonses she slapped against my front door. "Final notice, Mr. Davidson," she hissed, her perfectly manicured finger stabbing at the papers. "Remove all unauthorized infrastructure from HOA property or face immediate legal action and daily fines of $500. I looked past her at the small fiber optic cable running discreetly along my property line, the same cable that had been providing blazing fast internet to half the Pine Lake community for the past 18 months. What Karen didn't know, as she stood there in her designer blazer radiating smugness, was that she'd just declared war on the wrong person. Because that unauthorized infrastructure she was so desperate to remove? It belonged to North Star Fiber, the company I'd built from nothing and sold for $47 million 3 years ago. The same company that still employed me as their chief technical consultant. The same company that had exclusive internet service contracts with 60% of the homes in this very HOA. Karen's cold blue eyes narrowed as she waited for my response, probably expecting me to grovel or beg for mercy like the other homeowners she'd terrorized over the years. Instead, I folded the summonses calmly and slipped them into my back pocket. "I'll take care of this immediately," I said, giving her my most innocent smile. She had no idea she'd just handed me the perfect weapon for her own destruction. 3 months earlier, I'd been living my dream retirement in my grandfather's restored 1920s cabin on Pine Lake. After spending 15 years building North Star Fiber from a basement startup into the region's premier internet service provider, I'd finally sold the company, but stayed on as a consultant to help with their expansion into rural communities. The money from the sale had given me the freedom to focus on what I loved, restoring vintage cabins and enjoying the peace of lakefront living. The cabin had been in our family for generations, a rustic 2-bedroom retreat with knotty pine walls and a stone fireplace that my grandfather had built with his own hands. When I inherited it, the place was falling apart, but 18 months of careful restoration had brought it back to life. New roof, updated electrical, restored hardwood floors, and yes, a state-of-the-art fiber optic internet connection that I'd personally designed and installed. That's when I first encountered the Pine Lake Homeowners Association, and more specifically, its tyrannical president, Karen Pemberton. She'd shown up unannounced on a Tuesday morning, clipboard in hand, wearing the kind of fake smile that immediately put you on guard. "Mr. Davidson, I'm Karen Pemberton, HOA president," she'd announced, not waiting to be invited in as she pushed past me into my cabin. "We need to discuss several violations I've identified during my property inspection." I followed her as she strutted through my home, making notes on her clipboard and taking photos with her phone. "Violation 1, she declared, pointing at my restored vintage mailbox. "Non-standard mailbox design." "Violation 2, she continued, gesturing at my cabin's original dark green shutters. "Unauthorized paint color deviation from approved palette." But it was when she stepped onto my back deck that her eyes lit up with predatory excitement. There, running along the edge of my property line, about 6 inches inside my boundary stakes, was the thin black fiber optic cable that connected my cabin to the main North Star network hub 3 miles away. "And what," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "is this?" "Fiber optic internet cable," I replied honestly. "Runs from my cabin to the network junction box." Karen's smile widened as she pulled out her phone and began taking photos from every angle. "And do you have HOA approval for this?" I explained that the cable ran entirely within my property boundaries, installed by a licensed contractor with proper permits from the county. But Karen wasn't interested in facts. She'd found her target, and like a predator who'd caught the scent of wounded prey, she wasn't about to let go. "The Pine Lake HOA has very strict guidelines about external modifications and infrastructure," she lectured, still snapping photos. All installations require prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. What she didn't mention, what I wouldn't discover until weeks later, was that Karen had been systematically targeting homeowners for violations to generate fine revenue. The HOA was nearly bankrupt from her mismanagement, and she'd decided that aggressive enforcement was the solution. She'd already driven out 3 families with endless harassment and trumped-up violations, forcing them to sell their homes at significant losses just to escape her reign of terror. 2 days later, the first official notice arrived via certified mail. Violation notice, unauthorized infrastructure installation. Fine, $250. Compliance required within 15 days. But this was just the beginning of Karen's campaign against me. She began driving by my cabin multiple times a day, looking for new violations. She cited me for having my kayak stored improperly on my own dock. She claimed my outdoor furniture was the wrong color. She even tried to fine me for hanging laundry on a clothesline, claiming it was aesthetically displeasing to the community. But her obsession remained focused on that fiber optic cable. Week after week, the fines escalated. First $250, then $500, then $750. Each notice came with increasingly threatening language about legal action and property lines. "You're going to remove that cable, one way or another," she told me during one of her impromptu inspections. "I've dealt with people like you before, people who think they're above the rules. But I always win, Mr. Davidson. Always." The breaking point came when Karen discovered that several of my neighbors were also North Star Fiber customers. During her investigation, she'd learned that the main fiber trunk line ran through easements behind several homes in the subdivision, including some that served HOA board members. This gave her an idea, one that would prove to be her fatal mistake. She called an emergency HOA meeting for a Thursday evening in late October. The community center was packed with curious residents who'd been hearing rumors about Karen's war against internet infrastructure. What they got instead was a masterclass in how power can corrupt even the smallest authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," Karen announced from behind the podium, "we have a crisis in our community. Unauthorized telecommunications infrastructure has been installed without proper approval, creating safety hazards and legal liabilities for our association." She clicked through a PowerPoint presentation filled with scary-looking photos of utility cables and alarming statistics about property damage from unauthorized installations. Most of the photos weren't even from our community, but the residents didn't know that. "Therefore," she declared with dramatic flair, "I am announcing the Pine Lake Internet Infrastructure Compliance Initiative. Effective immediately, all telecommunications installations must be approved by the HOA, and all existing unauthorized infrastructure must be removed within 30 days. The room erupted in confused murmurs. Board member Janet Holbrook raised her hand tentatively. "Karen, does this include our existing internet service? Because most of us have North Star Fiber." Karen's smile was razor sharp. "If it wasn't properly approved, then yes, it all has to go." That's when elderly Mrs. Chen in the front row spoke up. "But my grandson works from home using our internet. How is he supposed to do his job?" "That's not the HOA's concern," Karen replied coldly. "Rules are rules, and compliance is mandatory." The meeting descended into chaos as residents realized what Karen was proposing. She wasn't just targeting me anymore, she was threatening to cut internet service to dozens of families, including several who worked from home, ran online businesses, or had children in remote learning programs. She was about to learn just how wrong she was. The next morning, I made a phone call to Marcus Rodriguez, current CEO of North Star Fiber and my former business partner. We'd built the company together, and even after the sale, we remained close friends and collaborators. "Marcus, I need a favor," I said, explaining the situation with Karen and the HOA. The forest of raised hands was overwhelming. Karen looked around the room in shock as the community she'd terrorized for years finally found their voice to reject her leadership. But my revenge was just getting started. The next morning, I implemented the second phase of my plan. Using my technical access to North Star's systems, I began documenting every piece of infrastructure in the Pine Lake community. Not just fiber optic cables, but every utility connection, every cable TV line, every telephone service entry point. What I discovered was a goldmine of violations by Karen's own standards. Her home had no fewer than 6 different utility connections, none of which had been approved by the Architectural Review Committee. Her satellite dish was mounted in direct violation of the HOA's own guidelines. Even her mailbox was technically non-compliant with the standards she'd been enforcing against other residents. But the real prize was her husband Richard's home office setup. As a business consultant, he'd installed a commercial-grade telecommunications package that included multiple internet connections, dedicated phone lines, and a cellular signal booster that required a small antenna array on their roof. I spent 3 days preparing a comprehensive violation report, complete with photos, measurements, and detailed citations of every HOA rule that the Pembertons had broken. The irony was delicious by Karen's own enforcement standards. They owed more than $15,000 in fines and faced immediate compliance orders. On Friday morning, I personally delivered the violation notices to their front door, using the exact same format Karen had used against me and other residents. The look on Richard Pemberton's face when he opened the door was priceless confusion, recognition, and dawning horror, all rolled into one expression. "Mr. Davidson, what's this about?" he asked, flipping through the stack of notices. "Your wife established a precedent that all infrastructure installations require prior HOA approval," I explained pleasantly. "These are violation notices for your satellite dish, cellular booster, business telecommunications equipment, and several other non-compliant installations." Richard's face went pale as he read through the documents. "But we've lived here for 8 years. This equipment has been here the whole time." "I'm sure it has," I agreed. "But according to your wife's interpretation of HOA authority, that doesn't matter. All unauthorized infrastructure must be removed, and accumulated fines must be paid in full." I left him standing in his doorway, staring at violation notices that totaled more than $20,000 in fines. But I wasn't finished with the Pembertons yet. That afternoon, I made another call to Marcus. "I need you to terminate service to 247 Lakeshore Drive," I said. "David, are you sure about this? Cutting someone's internet service is pretty extreme, even for revenge." "Marcus, they demanded that all unauthorized infrastructure be removed. Their service agreement was never approved by the Architectural Review Committee. By their own standards, they're in violation and should be disconnected immediately." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "All right, but I want this documented thoroughly. If they try to claim we're retaliating, I want a paper trail showing we're just following their own stated policies." "Already handled," I assured him. "I've prepared a complete compliance report showing that we're simply enforcing the same standards they demanded for every other resident." At exactly 4:47 p.m. on Friday afternoon, Richard Pemberton's internet service was disconnected for failure to comply with local infrastructure requirements. The timing was perfect, right in the middle of an important video conference with a major client. Karen called me 17 times that evening. I didn't answer. Saturday morning brought even more satisfaction. Word had spread through the community about Karen's removal as HOA president and the revelation that I owned the company providing their internet service. My phone was ringing constantly, with neighbors calling to share their own stories of Karen's harassment and to thank me for finally standing up to her. Mrs. Chen called to tell me that Karen had tried to fine her grandson for parking his car in their own driveway because it was improperly positioned. Tom Fletcher shared that Karen had demanded he paint his boat dock to match his house, then cited him for having a non-approved paint color when he complied. The stories went on and on, painting a picture of systematic abuse that had been festering for years. But the most interesting call came from Janet Holbrook, the former board member who'd found her courage during the community meeting. "David, we're holding an emergency election for new HOA leadership tomorrow. Would you be interested in running for president?" I thought about it for about 2 seconds. "Actually, Janet, I think you'd make an excellent president. But I'd be happy to serve on the board if you think it would help." "That would be perfect," she said. "We need someone who understands both the technical and legal aspects of community management." Sunday's election was a landslide. Janet won the presidency with 93% of the vote, and I was elected to the board, along with Dr. Bradley and Tom Fletcher. Our first official act was to formally apologize to every resident who'd been harassed by the previous administration and to establish a review process for all outstanding fines and violations. But Karen wasn't done fighting. On Monday morning, she showed up at my cabin with her husband and a lawyer, a thin, nervous-looking man who kept checking his phone and seemed like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Mr. Davidson," the lawyer began in a reedy voice, "my clients believe you've engaged in a campaign of harassment and retaliation. They're prepared to file suit for intentional infliction of emotional distress, abuse of corporate power, and interference with business relationships." I listened politely, then invited them all inside for coffee. "Before you file anything," I said, pulling out a thick folder of documents, "I think you should review these materials." The folder contained copies of every violation notice Karen had issued over the past 2 years. Documented evidence of HOA funds mismanagement, records of her harassment campaigns against former residents, and a detailed analysis showing that her enforcement actions had generated over $50,000 in fines while providing no corresponding community benefits. "I've also prepared a comprehensive report on the Pemberton's own HOA violations," I continued, sliding another folder across the table. "By Karen's own enforcement standards, you currently owe the community more than $25,000 in accumulated fines." The lawyer spent 10 minutes reviewing the documents, his face growing paler with each page. Finally, he looked up at the Pembertons. "We need to discuss this privately." They huddled in the corner of my living room for several minutes, their voices growing increasingly agitated. Finally, the lawyer returned to the table. "My clients are willing to drop all claims in exchange for restoration of their internet service and dismissal of outstanding violations," he said. "Counteroffer," I replied. "The Pembertons will publicly apologize to every resident they've harassed, reimburse all excessive fines collected during Karen's tenure, and agree to a permanent restraining order preventing them from holding any HOA office or committee position." Karen exploded. "That's outrageous. You can't just—" "Karen," her husband interrupted sharply, "we don't have a choice. Without internet, I can't run my business. We'll lose everything." The lawyer looked like he wanted to disappear. "My clients will consider your terms." That afternoon, I received a call from Dr. Bradley. "David, you need to see this. Karen's been posting on the community Facebook page, claiming you're part of some corporate conspiracy to take over the HOA." I pulled up the Pine Lake community page on my laptop and scrolled through Karen's increasingly unhinged posts. She'd written a 2,000-word manifesto about corporate infiltration and staged coups that read like something from a conspiracy theory website. The comments section was brutal, resident after resident sharing their own stories of her harassment and expressing support for the new HOA leadership. But the most telling comment came from someone I didn't recognize. Karen Pemberton destroyed 3 communities before Pine Lake. She was run out of Riverside Estates for the same tactics. Someone should warn the next neighborhood she targets. I screenshot everything and forwarded it to Marcus. "We might need this for our legal files," I wrote. His response was immediate, "Already on it. Our lawyers are documenting everything in case she tries to escalate." Wednesday brought the resolution I'd been hoping for. The Pemberton's lawyer called to accept my terms. Karen would make a public apology at the next community meeting, reimburse all residents for excessive fines, and sign an agreement preventing her from holding any HOA position for the next 5 years. But the real satisfaction came that evening when I got a call from Marcus. "David, you're not going to believe this. We just got a contract request from Maplewood Hills, that's the new development 15 miles south of Pine Lake. Apparently, word has spread about our customer service and community involvement. They want us to handle all their telecommunications infrastructure." "That's great news," I said. "It gets better. Their HOA president specifically mentioned that they heard about how we stood up to unreasonable demands from Pine Lake. They want a provider who won't be intimidated by power-hungry board members." I couldn't help but laugh. Karen's campaign against me had inadvertently become the best marketing North Star could have asked for. The following Saturday, Pine Lake held its first community meeting under new leadership. The community center was packed again, but the atmosphere was completely different from the contentious meetings under Karen's regime. People were smiling, chatting with neighbors, and actually seemed happy to be there. Janet called the meeting to order and immediately addressed the elephant in the room. "Before we discuss regular business, Mrs. Pemberton has requested an opportunity to address the community." Karen walked to the podium like she was approaching her own execution. Her usual perfect appearance was disheveled, and she seemed to have aged years in the past 2 weeks. "I want to apologize to the Pine Lake community," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "My enforcement of HOA rules became excessive and unfair. I let power go to my head, and I hurt people who deserved better." She went on to specifically apologize to Tom Fletcher for the boat dock harassment, to Mrs. Chen for the parking violations, and to the 3 families she'd driven from the community with her aggressive tactics. The apology was clearly scripted by her lawyer, but the humiliation was genuine. When she finished, the room was silent. No one applauded, but no one booed either. She'd hurt too many people for forgiveness to come easily, but at least she'd acknowledged the damage she'd caused. After Karen left, Janet presented the new HOA's first initiative, a community improvement fund that would use the recovered fine money to install better lighting around the lake, upgrade the community center's facilities, and establish a fund for residents facing financial hardships. The old administration collected over $50,000 in fines during the past 2 years, Janet announced. Under our new policies, that money will be returned to the community through improvements and services that benefit everyone. The applause was thunderous. But the evening's biggest surprise came when Dr. Bradley took the podium for what he called a special recognition. "Most of you know that David Davidson exposed the previous administration's abuses and helped us establish new leadership," he said. "But what you might not know is that David has volunteered to personally oversee a community-wide internet upgrade at no cost to the HOA. I hadn't planned to announce the project so publicly, but Marcus and I had been discussing ways to give back to the community that had supported us. Upgrading the entire Pine Lake network to North Star's latest fiber technology seemed like the perfect way to turn this whole experience into something positive. Every home in Pine Lake will have access to gigabit internet service," I explained as I joined Dr. Bradley at the podium. "We're also installing public Wi-Fi throughout the community center, the boat launch area, and the walking trails around the lake." The response was overwhelming. People were cheering, applauding, and several residents came up to shake my hand and thank me personally. It felt good to be part of a community again instead of fighting against corrupt leadership. Over the following weeks, I watched the Pine Lake community transform under new leadership. The constant tension that had defined HOA meetings under Karen's regime was replaced by collaborative discussions about genuine community improvements. Residents who'd been afraid to speak up during Karen's reign began participating in committees and volunteer projects. Tom Fletcher organized a community boat regatta for the first time in 5 years. Mrs. Chen started a community garden that brought together families from across the neighborhood. Dr. Bradley established a telemedicine clinic that provided basic healthcare services to elderly residents who had trouble traveling to appointments. But my favorite development was watching Janet grow into her role as HOA president. The woman who'd been too intimidated to speak up during Karen's meetings had become a confident leader who genuinely cared about serving the community rather than controlling it. 3 months after the confrontation that started everything, I was sitting on my cabin's back deck, watching the sunset over Pine Lake and enjoying the fastest internet connection in 3 counties. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Northstar just landed another major contract thanks to the Pine Lake story. Our customer satisfaction ratings are through the roof. I typed back, best advertising investment we never meant to make. But the real victory wasn't business-related. It was the knowledge that a small community had stood up to a bully and taken back control of their neighborhood. Karen Pemberton's reign of terror was over, and Pine Lake was finally the peaceful lakeside community it was supposed to be. That evening, I got one last call related to the whole Karen situation. It was from a reporter at the regional newspaper who'd heard about the HOA drama and wanted to write a story about corporate executives fighting back against unreasonable homeowners associations. Thanks, but no, I told her. This was never about corporate versus individual power. It was about a community standing up to someone who was abusing her authority to hurt people. But surely you want credit for taking down a corrupt HOA president? I thought about that for a moment, looking out at the lake where several neighbors were enjoying an evening boat ride. The credit belongs to every resident who finally found the courage to say enough. I just happened to have the right tools to help them do it. As I hung up the phone, I realized that my grandfather's old cabin had become something more than just a retirement retreat. It had become the center of a community that had learned to stand up for itself, and that was worth more than any amount of money I'd ever made in business. The fiber optic cable that had started the whole confrontation was still running along my property line, still providing blazing fast internet to my cabin and dozens of other homes in the neighborhood. But now it represented something bigger than just technology infrastructure. It represented the connections that bind a community together when they decide to fight for what's right. Karen Pemberton had tried to tear down those connections with her campaigns of harassment and intimidation. Instead, she'd accidentally helped us build them stronger than ever. And sometimes, that's exactly how justice is supposed to work, not through corporate power or legal threats, but through ordinary people deciding they've had enough of being pushed around and finding the courage to push back. The sun set over Pine Lake that night, with a community finally at peace, and I fell asleep to the sound of data flowing through fiber optic cables that would never again be threatened by petty tyrants who mistook authority for power. Karen Pemberton had learned the hard way that some fights aren't worth starting, especially when you don't know who you're really fighting against. In the end, she'd gotten exactly what she'd asked for. All unauthorized infrastructure had indeed been removed. It just wasn't the infrastructure she'd expected.